So hello and welcome to the first installment of WWP's Winter Webinar Series. My name is Adam Bronstein. I'm the Oregon-Nevada Director with Western Watersheds Project. I'm presenting from my home in Central Oregon, the traditional lands of the Tenino and the Confederate tribes of Warm Springs, Siletz, and Grand Ronde. Today's webinar, entitled Can We Save the Sage-Grouse?, puts all of us on the spot and asking what we can do as activists, public lands managers, and American citizens to save this iconic species of the high desert. A recent report by the United States Geological Survey detailing Greater Sage-Grouse population's status has found an 80% range-wide decline since 1965 and a further 40% decline since 2002. While development pressures and impacts from energy and mining are a clear and present danger, domestic livestock grazing stands out as the biggest threat to the species across their range. Cattle destroy the fragile sagebrush and riparian ecosystems that sage-grouse depend on throughout their life stages. The Bureau of Land Management, which manages the vast majority of sage-grouse habitat across the West, has recently opened a process to re-examine multi-state conservation plans for the species. Western Watersheds Project and our partners are engaging in this process in hopes of charting a new course for sage-grouse that will properly identify the threats that they face and implement meaningful management reforms. We have three panelists this evening: Erik Molvar, Executive Director with Western Watersheds Project; Sarah Stelberg, Staff Attorney with Advocates for the West; and Steve Holmer, Vice President of Policy with American Bird Conservancy. So a big thanks to our panelists and for the audience. We really appreciate you guys joining us today. So each presenter will have about 20 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session. So Patrick Kelly, our Idaho director, is going to be managing questions. So, hello, Patrick. So if you guys want, you can type in a question in the chat during a presentation, and then Patrick will go through those and sort them and ask them on your behalf to the panelists. So after we go through all of our presentations, we'll have that question and answer session for all of you. So that's all I have for right now. Erik Molvar, over to you.
Well, thank you, Adam. I'm Erik Molvar. I'm the wildlife biologist and executive director of Western Watersheds Project, joining you from Arapahoe and Northern Cheyenne ancestral lands in Laramie, Wyoming. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if it will let me start the slideshow. Oops. There we go. I think that's right. Okay, so I am going to, let's see if we're sharing here. Okay, does everything look good on your end, Adam?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, well, anyway, my presentation is on the biological requirements of sage-grouse, the science that should be informing our conservation standards. And fair warning, I'm not necessarily going to be reading my slides because, number one, that's kind of annoying. But number two, I'd rather have a more conversational flow. So just note that that some of the text on there is going to be maybe a little bit in addition to what I have to say. And first of all, I'd like to point out that the sage-grouse is pretty well known to be an umbrella species for 350 other species that inhabit the sagebrush ecosystems in the American West. And one of the reasons that sage-grouse conservation is so important is that sage-grouse require large tracts of undisturbed sagebrush habitat. So if you can save enough habitat in enough pristine condition so that sage-grouse can survive and thrive, theoretically, you're saving habitat for all kinds of other species. And there have been some studies that go into the individual species that are rare and how well the sage-grouse covers them. For species that are sagebrush obligates, like the sage sparrow or the sage thrasher, the overlap is quite high. For some of the species in the sagebrush biome, like the Wyoming pocket gopher that lives in areas that don't have a lot of sagebrush, there might be less overlap for that. And so the sage-grouse might not give you protection for all the species. One of the interesting things that Copeland et al. 2014 pointed out is that if you're protecting sage-grouse habitat, you're also protecting mule deer migration corridors. And of course, pronghorn are in that same category, and a lot of elk and mule deer winter ranges are in sagebrush habitats as well. So if for folks that are hunters, that's their main interest in protecting those large hunted animals, saving the sage-grouse is in their interest as well. This is the population trend of sage-grouse since 1960, and this is taken from the Coates et al. 2021 population study from the U.S. Geological Survey. And what you're looking at here are three different trend lines. The yellow one is the short-term trend line. The middle term one is the pink trend line, and the blue one is the long-term trend line. And what I need you to see here is that all of those trend lines are downward. So as you can see, the sage-grouse have peaks and troughs in their population estimates. And, you know, they're right now in the media, there's some argument about whether they're cyclic or not cyclic, but linear and just random oscillations. It seems to be that, that these oscillations in sage-grouse populations are tied to things like drought, which depresses sage-grouse populations, and also late cold springs, which suppresses your recruitment of sage-grouse chicks and the survival of the eggs. But regardless of whether you're calling it cyclic or random oscillations, the populations go up and down. The long-term trend for the peaks is downward. The long-term trend for the troughs also goes downward. And for individual lek populations, when that trend line hits 0 males, because there's so much lek fidelity, that means that population is not going to come back. And that's what's been happening. The other thing I want to point out about this study is that Coates pretty much arbitrarily put the cutoff at 6 cycles. He could have gone back 8 cycles, and the long-term decline would have been a lot steeper. If you're looking at things on a state-by-state basis, since the sage-grouse plan amendments were finalized, the population declines are anywhere between kind of 33% and 61%. And some of that is due to the, you know, kind of the ups and downs of sage-grouse population. But one of the take-home message is that the sage-grouse populations, or the sage-grouse plan amendments that were put in place in 2015, and which have been in place more or less ever since, are not doing the job of recovering the sage-grouse and letting them rebound back up to healthy population levels. And here's a slide showing the range shrinkage since the original range. It looks like we've lost about 53% of the sage-grouse habitats that are where the sage-grouse are completely extirpated. So these are vast areas, millions of acres that should have sage-grouse, and they're gone. And some of this is because the sagebrush is gone. Some of it's been converted into crop fields. In some cases, there's been a lot of fire. And in other cases, there's been human development. And all of those things have led to sage-grouse losses. In other areas, there's none of those things. And the only human change since, you know, human caused change since the pre-settlement period is that the sage-grouse are now experiencing livestock grazing. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about here is livestock grazing. And that's something a lot of times the agencies don't want to talk about at all. In fact, if you look at the famous 2011 Studies of Avian Biology sage-grouse monograph that was supposed to cover all the factors that affect sage-grouse, there's no chapter on livestock grazing, despite the fact that the 2010 warranted but precluded finding found that livestock grazing was one of the major threats that faced the sage-grouse. And one of the first things I want to talk about in relationship to livestock is cheatgrass. And first of all, there's good science now, and there has been for about 100 years, that heavy livestock grazing and overgrazing and the damage that happens and disturbance to the native perennial bunch grasses is what is the functional switch that causes cheatgrass to have a toehold and to go from a minor component in the ecosystem to a very major component, and indeed sometimes to a monoculture. And this photograph is a photograph by Matt Lavin. It's a great photograph illustrating how it works. On the right half of the photo, what you see is a cheatgrass infested sagebrush stand. So in other words, the grazing has been heavy here. The cheatgrass is invaded. It is completely forming the understory. And then to the left, what you see is when it burns. And when it burns, it takes out the sagebrush. And since sage-grouse need the sagebrush to survive, not just for hiding cover for their nests, but also it's more than 90% of their annual diet is sagebrush buds and leaves. It pretty much, when you get cheatgrass invasion in the understory, it leads to these frequent wildfires, and that wipes out the sagebrush. And then it's pretty much game over for sage-grouse habitat. Notably, on bare ground, cheatgrass wind dispersal only goes, maybe 20 to 60 feet. So the cheatgrass seeds don't travel very far without the help of their transportation system, which is livestock fur and hooves. And so the livestock are not only suppressing the native perennial bunch grass and the biological soil crusts that are the native ecosystem's best defense against cheatgrass invasion in the first place, but they're also actively carrying the cheatgrass seeds around and basically serving as cheatgrass rototillers, if you will, to kind of convert the native sagebrush habitat ultimately through the intervention of fire to cheatgrass monoculture. It's important to note that not only that sage-grouse really avoid cheatgrass infested habitats, and it's really poor sage-grouse habitat, but also that once you get cheatgrass and fire and you have basically cheatgrass monoculture, then that really strongly is correlated with sage-grouse population declines. This is a major, major problem. And according to Downs et al. In 2016, some 60.3 million acres of sage-grouse habitats, and that's both Greater Sage-Grouse and Gunnison sage-grouse across the West, have at least 2% cheatgrass cover. And that's in the category of either heavily invaded or right on the brink, just waiting for a big fire to become a monoculture. And in case you might hear some of the messaging from the livestock industry and their apologists, and sadly to say, the scientific community and the government community, they like to say, oh yes, we had heavy overgrazing during the early 1900s, and that's really when cheatgrass became a problem. But now the levels of livestock grazing aren't promoting cheatgrass. Here are two GIS-based remote sensing looks at what the cheatgrass extent was on the left in 1990, on the right in 2018. And you see that over that 28-year span, the cheatgrass infestations have radically spread. And some of this, of course, is climate related and the fact that we have more frequent fires. And some of it is that we have a level of livestock grazing that continues to enable the cheatgrass to spread. And one of the key factors that livestock grazing impacts is it impacts the amount of available hiding cover for the sage-grouse. So if you look at the sage-grouse, especially the hens, their big escape is to escape detection from their predators. And the critical piece of that is the grass in between the sagebrush. If it's above 7 inches and above 10.2 inches in the far eastern part of the range in the Dakotas, they've got enough to escape detection. If it gets down much below that, then the sage-grouse become vulnerable. And there's pretty good, and we're going to get a little visitation from my cat, so don't mind him. There's pretty good evidence over a large span of years and multiple studies, including Hagen et al. 2007, which is a review article that covers all the studies up to that point, finding that there's a really strong correlation between having that 7 inches of grass height and having good sage-grouse nest survival. And notably, in the current sage-grouse plans, most of those sage-grouse plans call for a habitat objective of that height. Now, interestingly, I was in Congress to testify on a panel on the House Resources Committee about livestock grazing, and one of my co-presenters was Dave Noggle, who's a biologist out of the University of Montana, but also is the head of the NRCS's Sage-Grouse Initiative. He's what they call their senior scientist. And Noggle, in his testimony, and this raised my eyebrows, said that grazing restrictions on public lands assume a 7-inch grass height to hide nests from predators. And that's true. He said, our final examination shows that biased field methods incorrectly attribute higher nest survival to this 7-inch grass height, bringing current public policy, land policy into question. After correcting for this bias, grass height at the hatched and failed nests were within the thickness of penny of a penny of one another. In other words, he's saying that grass height actually doesn't matter once you correct this bias that he says he's identified. And this is a giant pile of horse manure. Now, looking up at the top, you see another one of Dave's quotes later in the testimony where he explains that the generation of scientists, himself included, have been measuring it the wrong way, and they artificially created this relationship of grass height to nest success. But when you actually look at the study that he's referring to that makes this claim, that study looked at 3 data sets. One that was published by Doherty et al. In 2014, and 2 unpublished studies, one in Montana and one in Utah. And when he applied this correction to those grass heights in the unpublished studies, he got them to flip. In other words, he got a positive correlation with grass height and nest success with the original way of measuring that. But when he did the correction, all of a sudden grass height was non-significant. But when he looked at the Doherty et al. Data, that Doherty et al. Data stayed significant. And looking at the Doherty et al. Findings, it was pretty darn strong. And you can see the quote from Doherty et al. It basically says the high predictive power of grass height illustrates its utility as a management tool to increase nest success within priority landscapes. And notice that both of these studies, Dave Noggle was a co-author. So basically, he told Congress that, hey, our past studies that we published said that grass height was a significant factor for sage-grouse nest success, but when you correct it, that's no longer the case. Well, guess what? His published studies, which he was a co-author, are still significant for grass height. So Dave Noggle lied to Congress. I also like to note that Forbes are critical habitats for sage-grouse, and that publication that's key on that is Dumrose et al. In 2015. And they're important because in the early brood rearing season and the late brood rearing season, the sage-grouse chicks not only forage heavily on forbs, which are these broadleaf plants as opposed to grasses, but also the forbs are heavily correlated with insects, and that's also a key source of protein for the growing chicks. And it's important to note that while cattle are the big culprit in knocking down the grass height, domestic sheep really key in on forbs. So domestic sheep can have a major impact as well. Along with livestock, you get fences. And barbed wire fences turn out to be basically guillotines for low-flying sage-grouse. They can't see them, and they fly into them, and they basically get decapitated. And this is a much bigger problem than anybody is really talking about. One study from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department found that 146 sage-grouse were killed on just one single 5-mile stretch of fence over a 2.5 year period. There are hundreds of thousands of miles of barbed wire fence in sage-grouse habitat. Probably this particular study was in an area close to a lek that had unusually high strike rates. But if you add even half or a third or a quarter or a fifth of that kind of sage-grouse mortality, it might well be that fences are the single biggest cause of adult sage-grouse mortality out there. And so getting rid of these fences is really important. Importantly, one of the new trends out there is to put fence markers, little plastic tabs, so the sage-grouse can see them. And it turns out that those are not fully effective. You get anywhere between 57% and 83% reductions in mortality, which means that you have still 17% to 43% of the original mortality happening even on marked fences. So that's definitely not the silver bullet. Oil and gas impacts are a major issue for sage-grouse. And Matt Holleran's study in 2005, his PhD dissertation is the key piece of science even today. He found that if you have active drilling within 3.1 miles of a lek, or even a well site that's been completed, and in natural gas fields, that doesn't even have a pump jack that's moving. It's just silently out there producing natural gas. If it's within 2 miles of a sage-grouse lek, you're going to get lek declines. Also, if you have an access road within 2 miles, that causes lek declines. And it's really the human presence at the well site and the vehicle traffic along these roadways that's causing the disturbance that is depopulating these sage-grouse leks. And there's a 2 to 10 year time lag. So you're not going to see that impact on populations immediately. It's going to happen over time as the older males and females hang around and keep having fidelity to those damaged landscapes, but the yearlings take off. Lek buffers are something that's always been really important. The key scientific standard here is this largest hoop, which is 5.3 miles. This was the 5.3 mile buffer, which covers the 92.5% of sage-grouse nests. That's from Holleran and Anderson, 2005. In Meneer et al., when they did their kind of literature review of lek buffers, they created what they called an interpretive range of 3.1 to 5 miles as the appropriate buffer for development. Of course, when the feds did their 2015 sage-grouse plans, they did the lowest end possible in most of the plans, or 3.1 miles. The National Technical Team recommended 4 miles as a buffer, which is more than the plans ended up with, which was the BLM's own scientists along with state scientists. And if you look inside these buffers, you'll see that how many square miles are contained within them tell a lot of the story. So if you protect the full 5.3 mile buffer around the lek where the sage-grouse are nesting, that's 88 square miles within for each lek. If you go down to the buffer that's in the Wyoming state plans, which is 0.6 miles, that's 1 square mile of habitat you have to protect from industrial development. So in some cases, the feds and the states wanted to pick a smaller area to protect. Site density is also key. There are 2 major studies that established this. First, there was Holleran in 2005 again, 1 well per 699 acres causing declines. Then you have Nick et al. At 3% surface disturbance per square mile is the critical threshold. These were the original studies that set both the well density and the surface disturbance. And these were set per square mile or maybe per 3 square miles at very small levels. But the way that's actually been applied is that the agencies create what they call a density disturbance calculation tool. So in Wyoming, you take a project boundary. This is a real life uranium mine that's about 4,200 acres in size. You buffer that by 4 miles. And then if you intersect any leks, you buffer those leks by another 4 miles. So for this real life example of a DDCT calculation, the project area is 4,200 acres. The DDCT area is 147,000 acres. So the BLM is picking a much larger area to water down the well sites per square mile and the disturbance percentage per square mile. And so what you get in this case is a project that's 8% of the permitted area within the project is going to get disturbed. That's well above the biological thresholds that sage-grouse can survive. And what you end up with once you water it down across 147,000 acres is less than 1% surface disturbance. So it's perfectly okay to approve this under the sage-grouse plans in 2015, and indeed they did. Importantly, no study ever in the history of science has looked at watering down the percentages of either site densities or percentages of surface disturbance across these kinds of vast areas, and even set an estimate of what that threshold would be. That's never been done. Yet every single sage-grouse plan does this, and they call them biologically significant units. They have a number of different kind of words for these very large areas, but the idea is to water them down. And by the way, I have to give credit where credit's due. It was a BLM employee that called my attention to this. It had escaped my attention that this was the cheat that they were using to get around these science-based thresholds, but that's what they did. In terms of noise, Gail Patricelli out in California did all of the original work on noise and all of the seminal work, but the most definitive recent science is Ambrose and others in 2021, finding that the appropriate background noise level is 14 decibels, and 10 decibels more than background is what we should be managing for. So in other words, a maximum of 24 decibels. Interestingly, the Bureau of Land Management historically has set the background net level at 39 decibels, and then the appropriate management level for that at 49 decibels, because the only study they had was from Camarillo, California, where they had orchards that had trimming machinery working all the time, and that was creating this misleadingly high level of background noise. That is not the background noise in the sagebrush steppes. Transmission lines are also a major problem for sage-grouse. There's some pretty good early information that they avoid areas between 5 and 10 miles from transmission lines. Some hypothesize that that's because they avoid tall structures. Others hypothesize that that it's because of corvid and raptor perching on the transmission towers. Other researchers connect those dots and say the sage-grouse are avoiding the tall structures because they think that there are going to be raptors and corvids perching on them. Multiple power lines in a Washington study were found to actually sever sage-grouse populations and create a dispersal barrier that basically cut the Washington sage-grouse population in two, having multiple power lines next to each other, like you see in this photo. Finally, raven abundance increases during power line construction, and they stay high after power line completion. The raven is an important nest predator, and there's good science now that show that perch inhibitors or putting little spikes on the flat surfaces to try and keep raptors and corvids from perching are completely ineffective. Renewable energy is coming to sage-grouse country. The Biden administration has said this is a priority to put these on public lands. We don't have to worry about, in addition to oil and gas and livestock, having a big increase in particularly wind turbines, but maybe also solar arrays in sage-grouse habitats. And we have pretty good evidence that sage-grouse can have their nest success and their brood rearing success decreased in wind turbines. More recent studies have had more ambiguous types of results in terms of the effect of wind turbines on sage-grouse. But Koppas et al. Did a worldwide literature review on all of the wind turbine effects on sage-grouse across all the different, or not just sage-grouse, but all the different grouse species. And their bottom line was keep sage-grouse habitat, or keep all grouse habitats free from wind energy development. And of course, that's what the National Technical Team recommended back in 2011 as well. So that's the state of play there. In terms of oops, I missed a slide here. West Nile virus, let's not lose track of it. Back in 2004, there was a big outbreak in the Powder River Basin. The coal bed methane wastewater ponds in that area were providing breeding habitat for the Culex tarsalis mosquitoes that are the obligate transmitter of West Nile virus between livestock, humans, sage-grouse. And sage-grouse have no natural immunity to West Nile virus. And so once they get infected, they're going to die. And there are some really good studies that were done in the early 2000s definitively linking coal bed methane wastewater ponds to increasing the risk of West Nile virus mortality. But there's nothing magic about the coal bed methane ponds. They look just like livestock ponds. So if you're putting out livestock ponds on the landscape, you're also providing mosquito habitat that's going to elevate your West Nile problems. And one study, Taylor et al. In 2012, predicted that the next West Nile virus outbreak was going to wipe out sage-grouse in northeastern Wyoming. So this is a really big issue that we can't lose track of because these pandemics of diseases kind of come and go. I want to mention sage-grouse or Gunnison sage-grouse because there's a really interesting study that was done by Cam Aldridge and others down in Colorado, finding that sage-grouse avoid nesting in areas or they nest in areas that have less than 1 mile of road per square mile. So there's a road density for Gunnison sage-grouse that's been established. They tend to nest farther than 5 miles from major roads, and they tend to avoid areas with more than 2% development in a 1.5 kilometer square moving window. And that in the Gunnison Basin is mostly residential development. As an added bonus, I threw in vegetation treatments because we can't avoid talking about those. We now know, and it's settled science, that sagebrush treatments are universally bad for sage-grouse. There was initially a study on the Deseret Land and Livestock Company where the initial results were that they could use these Lawson aerators and maybe take out a little bit of the sagebrush, leave most of it behind, and get short-term population boosts. But as they studied that over the long term, they found out that those population boosts then sank more than the surrounding land populations. And in the end, there was no advantage at all of doing that to sage-grouse. Juniper removal is a big trend in sage-grouse country. We're going to see more of it. In cases where they're in class 1 juniper stands, where the junipers are just starting to move out into the sagebrush, it can be effective. But when you remove the junipers in areas where they're dense or old growth, they don't have any understory, and you get major cheatgrass invasions, you don't get sage-grouse habitat. You can actually make things worse by creating a nexus for fire to move into areas that are adjacent to the junipers and wipe out sagebrush there too. So you can actually hurt things by doing juniper treatments in sage-grouse habitat if you're not restricting those treatments just to the areas where the junipers are very sparse and small. Finally, fuel breaks in sage-grouse country are being posed as a panacea. We're going to stop the fires using these fuel breaks. However, Shinham et al. Studied the last 30 years of fuel break construction in the West, and it's a major program. There's lots of water under the bridge. And he found that there was no advantage to making these sagebrush fuel breaks out in the open sagebrush in order to reduce fire or save sage-grouse habitat. So it's basically a make-work program. Going back to that National Technical Team report in 2011, they got it more or less right. The BLM and the state biologists and experts really, those recommendations are pretty close to what we have now. And in terms of the science, and they've held up very well. It's just that the agency hasn't had the political will to put them on the table. And I tried to make a slide with the literature cited on it so you could have a screenshot, but it was 4 pages of lit cited. So you can ask for the lit cited for us and we can send it to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Erik. Look forward to reviewing that presentation again once we're all wrapped up at some point here. All right, so Sarah, history of sage-grouse litigation and conservation efforts. We're gonna hand it over to you now. Thanks.
All right, great to be with everybody tonight and see some familiar names and faces. So I'm gonna pick up where Erik left off and talk about kind of the nexus between science and law and policy, and talk about historic efforts to conserve the sage-grouse and how those efforts have been prompted and then challenged in federal court. So let me do a screen share here of my slides. All right. Okay. So just to introduce myself, I'm a staff attorney with Advocates for the West. I have the pleasure of representing Western Watersheds Project in a lot of their litigation over the Greater Sage-Grouse. Advocates for the West has been working on these issues for over a decade now. It's a key issue for us and the work that we do. We are a nonprofit public interest law firm. We represent conservation groups for free. We provide pro bono legal services to groups like Western Watersheds Project to bring litigation that protects public lands and species like the sage-grouse. So just kind of an overview here of what I want to talk about. These are sort of the key steps that I identified in sage-grouse's conservation history, starting with the ESA listing efforts back in the early 2000s, still somewhat ongoing. And I think there's a question early on about whether the sage-grouse has ever been listed on the ESA, Endangered Species Act. It has not for lack of trying. And I'll go over some of the petitions that were filed to list the sage-grouse. And then there were some early lawsuits challenging federal land use planning and actual implementation of those plans through issuance of leases and permits. And cases challenged all those decisions for failing to consider and prevent harm to sage-grouse. And then fast forwarding to more of the near term, we get the 2015 sage-grouse conservation plans, which were a huge step forward for sage-grouse. They improved protections for the bird. Some think they went too far. Conservation groups show that they didn't go far enough. They departed from the science that Erik just overviewed in a lot of significant ways. And then most recently, under the Trump administration, we got significant rollbacks to those 2015 sage-grouse conservation plans. And then also in recent years, we've had a lot of new litigation challenging the implementation of the 2015 sage-grouse conservation plans, or lack of proper implementation of those plans in federal agency decisions to issue permits and leases for development on public lands. So just as kind of something to keep in mind as I go through my slides is the question of why litigation. And this is you're gonna kind of see a theme through all of these, through the history that I present, which is the various ways in which litigation can help the conservation movement, and in particular, improving protections for sage-grouse. So the first thing that comes to mind when you think about litigation is you can stop a project, you can halt illegal activities. And that's certainly something that we do with our cases. So we can stop illegal oil and gas drilling or grazing on public lands. But we can also use litigation to enforce deadlines. For example, if someone files a petition to list the sage-grouse, there's a deadline for when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is supposed to act on that. And when they fail to act, we can go to court to enforce that deadline. We can protect procedural guarantees, like the right to comment on agency actions, or enforce the obligation to prepare an environmental review of environmental actions, or sorry, of agency actions. We can also help shape interpretations of laws and regulations. So those 2015 sage-grouse plans, they're pretty long and extensive, but there's a lot of ambiguity in what they require. And so we can use litigation to help shape and clarify some of the protections and what they mean. And then we can also use litigation to compel policy change. Something that you'll see is how the ESA litigation actually led to efforts to improve sage-grouse protections to avoid the outcome of actually listing the bird on the Endangered Species Act. And those were voluntary actions that were prompted by some litigation. All right. So digging into the details, I'm going to start with talking about the efforts to get the sage-grouse listed on the Endangered Species Act. And there's kind of two rounds in which this happened. The first round was in the early 2000s. There were 8 petitions to list sage-grouse under the Endangered Species Act. Some of these petitions sought to list the species in just a part of its range. Some sought to list the sage-grouse range-wide. And I think for time purposes, I'm just going to fast forward to the last one here. The first bullets here talk about petitions that dealt with kind of a smaller portion of the range. And all of these failed. The Fish and Wildlife Service, in every case, the best thing they decided was that listing for sage-grouse was warranted but precluded, which meant that they agreed that sage-grouse deserved protections under the Endangered Species Act, but that they had a whole list of higher priority species that needed to be listed first. So sage-grouse was sent to like this species purgatory where it sat without any protections, even though Fish and Wildlife Service had deemed it warranting protections under the ESA. The most important petition to focus on was, actually, it was a series of petitions filed by various environmental groups, including WWP, I believe, petitions to list the sage-grouse across its entire range. In 2005, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a decision on those petitions, and it found that sage-grouse did not warrant listing under the Endangered Species Act. WWP, with advocates for the West as their attorneys, challenged that decision in federal court here in Idaho, and the federal court overturned the not warranted finding due to improper political interference. And this is one of my favorite quotes in any federal court decision, talking about the just egregious conduct of one of the agency decision makers who was involved in the not warranted decision. The judge wrote, "The Fish and Wildlife Service decision was tainted by the inexcusable conduct of one of its own executives. Julie McDonald had a well-documented history of intervening in the listing process to ensure a decision not to list the species. Her tactics included everything from editing scientific conclusions to intimidating Fish and Wildlife Service staffers." So the court ordered Fish and Wildlife Service back to the drawing board to reconsider a listing for greater sage-grouse. And in the intervening years, some other factors were at play. Groups including Western Watersheds Project brought some other lawsuits challenging agency decisions for failing to protect the sage-grouse, challenging land use plans across the sage-grouse range, and then also challenging a whole host of grazing permits and oil and gas leases in sage-grouse habitat, and had some success in those cases that kept the pressure mounting. Meanwhile, the science was advancing. So a lot of the studies Erik mentioned were sort of prompted by these listing petitions and the renewed interest in conserving this greater sage-grouse and these upcoming Fish and Wildlife Service listing decisions. So on the right, you see this, it was called the monograph for sage-grouse. It included a ton of chapters on population trends, on habitat needs, so really changed the state of sage-grouse science. And then there were also efforts to identify priority habitats, which hadn't been done before. And these eventually led to some of the priority habitats that were mapped in the sage-grouse conservation plans. So we've got pressure from litigation, the science is advancing. So finally, in 2010, the Fish and Wildlife Service issues its new ESA listing decision for sage-grouse, and it reaches a warranted but precluded decision, which it had done for all of the other listing petitions that came earlier. And so again, this sent sage-grouse to this purgatory where it got no protections, even though the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that it needed protections, that it wasn't in a that it was not on a good track. And the key rationale that the Fish and Wildlife Service cited was inadequate regulatory mechanisms to prevent habitat loss and fragmentation. And this will come up later because it was this rationale that prompted efforts to improve those regulatory mechanisms to avoid an ESA listing. So the precluded part of that decision, of the warranted but precluded decision, was challenged in court and led to a settlement that required the Fish and Wildlife Service to decide by 2015 whether to list the birds. This was kind of a shit or get off the pot moment, excuse my language, but Fish and Wildlife Service had to decide either to actually issue a listing decision or to decide that the bird did not warrant listing. It couldn't just leave it under this warranted but precluded status. And this is where things really heated up. This is where sage-grouse conservation efforts really started to move forward quickly. And this is where we get into the territory of the sage-grouse conservation plans. So prompted by this warranted but precluded decision and the threat of an actual listing decision in 2015. Oops, wrong direction. Sorry, guys. All right, we get the National Sage-Grouse Planning Strategy. So this was an effort by the BLM and Forest Service to upgrade, to improve protections in their land use plans across the entire sage-grouse range, to designate priority habitat for the bird, to basically figure out the most important habitats to protect, and to adopt protections for sage-grouse habitat across public lands. So this map here you can see is the extent of this planning effort. It was massive, covered 10 Western states and 98 individual land use plans. And these plans addressed all those threats that Erik mentioned. So livestock grazing, although they barely address livestock grazing, oil and gas development, renewable development, pipelines, roads, transmission lines. They talked about things like wildfire and cheatgrass, and tried to improve the regulatory mechanisms in these plans enough that the Fish and Wildlife Service would not actually have to list the sage-grouse on the ESA in 2015. And they succeeded in doing that. So in 2015, Fish and Wildlife Service issued that ESA listing decision that it had to, under that out-of-court settlement. Greater sage-grouse was no longer warranted for listing due to the protections in these 2015 plans. So sage-grouse didn't get listed on the endangered species. Okay. So just a quick overview of what these plans do and do not do. Again, very important step forward for sage-grouse. These plans substantially improve protections for sage-grouse, but they also contain a number of loopholes and exceptions, reflecting basically a political compromise instead of what expert sage-grouse scientists had recommended. So this is a chart here just comparing what the teams of scientists that inform these plans had recommended they do, and then what the plans actually adopted. So for oil and gas, for example, scientists had recommended that it be prohibited in priority sage-grouse habitat. The 2015 plans allowed oil and gas leasing in sage-grouse priority habitat. Scientists have recommended 4-mile lek buffers so that basically you can't have oil and gas development within 4 miles of these sage-grouse leks or breeding grounds. And in states like Wyoming, for example, they adopted a 1/4-mile lek buffer in general habitat, which no study that I'm aware of supports. On mining, scientists had recommended prohibiting mining in occupied habitat. The plans leave most habitat open to oil and gas development. And one example that for those in Idaho hits close to home, certain areas of mining, of existing mining activity where there hadn't been mines, but there was some interest in mining, were actually withdrawn from habitat designations altogether. So sage-grouse use this habitat, but federal agencies refused to implement any protections for them. For grazing, the plans adopted basically no enforceable limits on grazing. There were lots of recommendations and acknowledgement of sage-grouse habitat needs, but they didn't go nearly far enough to actually adopt scientific recommendations for things like grass height or fence removal, things like that. All right, so sage-grouse plans, great step forward, didn't go far enough. Everyone filed lawsuits over them, including industry saying they went too far. Conservation groups, including a coalition that Advocates for the West represented, filed a lawsuit arguing that the plans departed from the best available science, that there was arbitrary exclusion of particular industries like oil and gas development in Wyoming that got sweetheart deals under these plans. But those lawsuits didn't actually go forward. Soon after they were filed, the Trump administration came into office and moved to gut the compromise that had been reached in 2015, moved to gut sage-grouse protections. And there were three key efforts to reduce those protections. The first was to amend the 2015 sage-grouse plans to weaken them. The second effort was to cancel a mining ban that had been proposed for 10 million acres of key sage-grouse habitat called sagebrush focal areas. This was like the cream of the crop habitat. And then they also prohibited BLM from mandating compensatory mitigation. And compensatory mitigation was it was basically a leave it better than you found it sort of policy that doesn't work well in practice, but it was an important measure in the 2015 plans that required if an oil and gas developer, for example, were to destroy 10 acres of sage-grouse habitat, they were supposed to provide equivalent improvements to sage-grouse habitat elsewhere, so there was no net loss of habitat across the range. And Trump prohibited BLM from adopting that type of mitigation. So we amended our lawsuit on behalf of WWP, the Center for Biological Diversity, and other groups to challenge these rollbacks. To great success, we got an injunction that prohibited BLM from adopting the weakening amendments to the 2015 sage-grouse plans. So today, the 2015 plans are still in effect. We also got a court order that BLM had unlawfully canceled that mining ban, and it ordered BLM to go back to the drawing board to reconsider it. And then the Biden administration has now indicated that it's going to be walking back from that compensatory mitigation policy from the Trump administration. All right. So what's next? I'm not going to go into this, but just want to flag that we're in a new era of sage-grouse planning, that the 2015 plans are still in effect, but we're likely to get new sage-grouse plans under the Biden administration. And Steve, who's up next, is going to talk about what those might look like. And just quickly, I want to talk about kind of this third part to sage-grouse litigation, which is implementation of the sage-grouse plans. So very quickly, these are 4 cases that Western Watersheds Project is a part of. The first 3 we are representing them on, and these are cases challenging oil and gas leasing and development, challenging a phosphate mine in Idaho, and then a gold mine in California, all in sage-grouse habitat and all with potentially severe consequences for the birds that live there. All right, so that's it for me. Over to you, Steve.
Great, thanks very much. Terrific. Get this presentation going here. Is this looking right, or does this look okay?
No, we want to get a full screen somehow. So maybe under view.
Yeah, I am not actually seeing view here. Okay, well,
show the taskbar and then go ahead and show the taskbar, and then you can present.
You want to try that, Steve? Okay, there you go.
there we go. How's that looking?
Looks
Great.
good.
Good.
Sorry about that. This is Steve Homer, and we'll start my video. I'm Vice President of Policy with the American Bird Conservancy, and just wanted to thank Western Watersheds Project for their inviting me on here and their leadership on sage-grouse conservation, as well as all the great work of advocates for the West. You know, where we are now is that we are in a process of beginning to engage the administration on the new round of plans. And here's what we're talking about here, this pristine sagebrush habitat. And I think, you know, we just heard from Sarah a really good, you know, overview about the problem of the denial of ESA protection. And this is still going on because right now there is currently in place a rider in Congress that is a firm listing prohibition. And so the grouse cannot receive protection even if they deserve it. And I think that, you know, when you look at all these, you know, decades now of machinations around ESA protection for the grouse, the thing to remember is that, you know, we're seeing a worsening plight of the grouse. And we, in all probability, would have been better off listing the grouse in the first place and gotten about the business of recovery. And so I think that, you know, looking forward, it's critically important that we just look at these issues honestly and let the science dictate the listing decisions and let the chips fall where they may. During this entire period, we need to remember that we saw continuing development of oil and gas and mines and roads and other rights of way. And now we have, I think, a much more dire situation. The task is much more difficult because as USGS projects, you know, we're likely to see continued range contractions. And I would say we even see a long-term risk of extinction. So, you know, the situation has gotten considerably worse. And so we're now in a situation where, in a sense, the bar has gotten higher. The hurdle is higher. We have to do more conservation to compensate for all of this dithering. And so when we look about, you know, reviving the national planning strategy, we are optimistic and we're seeing progress. And we appreciate the leadership that we're seeing from this administration and from the Bureau. They have announced that they're going to be revising, updating the plans. And I think that, you know, strengthening the plans is a critical foundation. The mineral withdrawal that had been stopped has been reinitiated. But I think that more needs to be done with that. Mitigation policy has started to come back into place. but more, again, needs to be done there. And then I think we need to think about how we're going to advance and develop new conservation measures. And so when we think about strengthening the plans, that really is all about the priority habitat management areas. And that means, not allowing areas to be excluded that should be included, and really following the best science to provide the level of protection that is needed for priority habitats. Another thing to consider is climate change. The last round of plans did not really adequately consider climate change. And again, when you look at some of the long-term projections, the impacts on wildlife populations and habitats can be quite severe. And so again, it points to the need to more conservation. Erik mentioned some issues in terms of calculating the disturbance cap. The idea here is that you're going to just, limit the amount of disturbance in these priority habitat areas. And the problem is that we have inconsistent cap standards. It's 3% in most places, but 5% in some, and the lowest it is in some areas is 1.5%. But when you look at the monitoring reports, what it reveals is that the current priority grouse populations on average live in areas with 0.77 disturbance, less than 1%. And we have very few of the populations being monitored that are over 1.5%. And so it's a strong indication that the current disturbance cap is much too high. And considering we're seeing declines at 0.77, it's an indication that we need to be thinking considerably lower. And another thing that happened in the aftermath of the last administration was some of the adaptive management provisions were weakened. And I think that there was a significant advance in land management planning by the Bureau when they included required adaptive management through the hard and soft trigger process. And so I think that putting that back in its full form is important, as well as just having consistent standards and following the best science across the range. And then when we look at the mineral withdrawal, our coalition submitted comments, and we think that the new circumstances need to be considered. The situation is considerably more. We think that all of the priority habitats should be analyzed for the benefits that a mineral withdrawal would provide. And in light of climate change, we need to consider, that fluid mineral withdrawal should also be included with there. And another thing that the plans talked about but haven't really adequately addressed yet is connectivity and the identification of wildlife corridors and wintering habitats. And here again, this is something that areas that would benefit from mineral withdrawal. And when we look at mitigation, one of the ideas of the plan was that if you were going to have impacts in priority habitat, that you would then fully mitigate them. And there were a number of significant policy developments. The Bureau of Land Management put a mitigation policy together. And then we had President Obama's memo about developing for resource development. And it's my understanding now that the BLM policy is back in place and that the Fish and Wildlife Service is in development of a policy. So we are seeing some of this coming back into force. But what we have not seen yet is for the presidential memo to be put back in effect. And I think it really needs to be. And the reason for that is that it went beyond regular mitigation and talked about identifying irreplaceable resources. These are places and resources, things that you don't want to lose. And it also required that there be a net conservation benefit standard for mitigation on public lands. And that's critically important because we have a finite amount of public lands. And if we continue to allow for industrial development, sooner or later, we won't have anything left. So there does need to be a way of balancing the slate. And that mitigation policy, I think, was really the first step towards that type of smart decision-making. So I'm hoping that we can see that be put back in effect. And then when we think about, new conservation measures, the current formula is talking about the disturbance cap and mitigation and, basically limiting development in these priority sage-grouse areas. And I would say that based on what we saw, after the ESA rider went into effect, wasn't promising. It really felt like a lot of the commitments and promises that were made were basically quickly abandoned, and that a number of the players that had supported the planning effort were some of the first in line, calling on the last administration to revoke those protections and to begin oil and gas drilling again in priority habitats. So there is a feeling like, without the Endangered Species Act as a backstop, that there's just like a real lack of durability. And so that we do feel like other types of conservation measures and designations need to be considered and analyzed as part of this new planning effort. And so we're hoping to see that happen, as well as the identification of restoration areas, because we believe that there's a lot of areas where fires have taken place and other activities where you could do active work that could provide for more and better habitat. And lastly, just mention that, as the America the Beautiful initiative is considered, the sagebrush sea is a unique American ecosystem that provides for hundreds of species. And so I think that it merits consideration for inclusion and analysis as part of that broader conservation initiative. And so thinking about next steps, right now there are an immediate action opportunity. Congress is currently considering whether or not the grouse should be eligible for ESA protection. They're considering this year's spending bill. It's still under debate. And right now, the ESA moratorium, listing moratorium, is not in the bill. Thankfully, the House and Senate appropriators did not include it. The administration did not ask for it in its budget. And so right now it is out. And it is our hope and desire that it stay out. It's critical that we have the backstop of the ESA put back. And so at this action alert, you can write a letter to your representative and senators urging them to support a strong ESA. And then, of course, there's going to be all kinds of comment opportunities as the new grouse plans are coming up. So stay tuned for upcoming action alerts from WWP and advocates and ourselves. Happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks, Steve. So what we're going to do now is we'll do a question and answer session, and Patrick has been compiling your questions. But briefly, before we jump into that, I just want to thank you all for being here. If you choose to not stick through the entire Q&A section, we invite you to support the work of Western Watersheds Project, Advocates for the West, and the American Bird Conservancy by becoming a member or making a donation. And you can reach us by going to westernwatersheds.org. Advocates for the West is advocateswest.org. And American Bird Conservancy is abcbirds.org. And make sure to stay tuned for future webinars from WWP. So we will be putting out notices. So Patrick, over to you. You're welcome to direct questions at our individual panelists, or you can just put it out there for anyone to answer.
Hey, great. Thanks, Adam. And thanks to Erik, Sarah, and Steve for some great presentations. So we've got a few questions coming in here on the chat. None of them were, most of them don't appear to be directed at any particular speaker. So I'd encourage you guys to chime in if you feel like you can contribute. Let's see, I will start with what I found to be an interesting question. So how does the increase in human outdoor activities affect the greater sage-grouse?
Well, let's start by having Steve unsharing his screen. That way we can get people's faces back up. Okay, go ahead if you want to ask that again.
Okay. That was, how does the increase in human outdoor activities affect the greater sage-grouse?
Well, I can begin. Certainly, there's some good science indicating that roads have a negative impact on sage-grouse, and what happens is that they gradually, kind of abandon those habitats that are, between 2 and 5 miles from roads, and that's because of road traffic and human traffic, and that's something as you have more and more recreation in sage-grouse habitat, and the BLM typically does not do seasonal road closures in sage-grouse nesting habitat in the same way that the Forest Service often closes roads in elk calving habitat or elk winter range. So, if there is an area that happens to be a recreational hotspot, for people to visit, car camping or driving around and whatnot. And, the vehicle traffic would be expected to be a disturbance factor to sage-grouse, both from a motion and a noise perspective. And interestingly, one of the interesting things that has come up in the Gunnison Basin for the Gunnison sage-grouse is that there are Gunnison Basin lands that have been proposed for an extensive increase in mountain biking trail development. And a lot of that is Gunnison sage-grouse identified habitat. So, one of the interesting questions that's going to be answered over time, I think, is, how is the Gunnison Field Office of the BLM going to respond to the proposals for these new mountain bike networks and loops that are in sage-grouse habitats, and whether they'll be closed during the critical seasons of use.
All right, thanks, Eric. Did Sarah, Steve, did you want to weigh on that at all? No? Okay, let's see. We have a big question. So is drought and/or climate change at all responsible for the sage-grouse decline?
Yes, I think is the obvious answer. And Erik probably knows more of the stats, but I think there's a recent study from USGS on just the sheer number of acres that we've lost due to wildfires, especially in the Great Basin. And as we all know, climate and drought exacerbate wildfires, both the intensity and the frequency of them. Sagebrush habitat is incredibly difficult to restore after wildfires. So this is a huge threat to sage-grouse moving forward. And I want to point out too that in our 2015 lawsuit against the conservation plans, one of the deficiencies we identified was the failure to address the threat of climate change and how natural factors like drought, well, not that they're completely natural, but that climate change was going to be exacerbating habitat loss going forward. So we needed to sort of address that as one of the cumulative threats to the species.
And I agree with everything Sarah just said. And just to add to that, drought kills adult sagebrush. And you think of sagebrush being a desert plant, so you wouldn't think that drought would kill them. But there have been places in southwestern Wyoming where we've lost large tracts of sagebrush to just drought, the lack of water. And drought can also affect seedling recruitment as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you, guys. Let's see. Let's move on here. We have how likely is it that there will be a change in allowing cattle to graze on public lands in the near future? Cattle operations seem to run everything from wolf management to influencing decision-making around the national parks and seashores, with Point Reyes as an example. Is this a lobbying issue?
Well, certainly the livestock industry has had an overwhelming influence on sage-grouse habitat policy. And even in the science, one of the things that's really interesting that the 2011 Studies in Avian Biology monograph, which was supposed to cover all the threats to sage-grouse, I mean, they even had they had a chapter on oil and gas, they had a chapter on transmission. They even had a chapter on wild horses, even though the chapter on wild horses said basically, well, only 11% of sage-grouse habitat even has wild horses, so not much of an issue. But they didn't have a chapter on livestock, interestingly enough. And there is a conspiracy of silence surrounding the impacts of livestock grazing on sage-grouse. Now, we have a pretty good body of science that says that if you can keep 7 inches of grass height on the ground, that would be conducive to sage-grouse. And there have been a few studies from Montana where they have shown that once you hit that 7-inch threshold and you have still cattle grazing, that you can maintain your sage-grouse habitat effectiveness. And I think that applies across the board throughout the West, except for, again, in the Dakotas. But the livestock industry is very politically influential and very powerful. And their lobbying kind of reaches into these agencies, even some of the science, folks, and suppresses the idea that livestock is the culprit for some of these sage-grouse declines. But when you actually look at it out on the ground, the vast majority of sage-grouse habitat does not have any effects of transmission lines, doesn't have oil and gas fields, doesn't have wind energy development. The only human influence out there is livestock grazing. So unless that you have some magical sage-grouse depressor out there in these areas that don't have these industrial types of development, then the obvious answer is that livestock is the culprit and we need to manage that. And I think it needs to be put to the livestock industry that, hey, if you can meet these thresholds that sage-grouse need, then, you know, maybe there's a room for you in sage-grouse habitat. But if you can't, or it's not profitable, maybe this is not the place to raise beef.
Okay, thanks, Erik. Sarah, Steve, are you wanting to weigh in on that, or? Okay. Just a real quick aside, there's a very lively discussion going on about wild horses in the chat, which is wonderful. I'm glad people are sharing their opinions, but it's kind of hard to read the question. So if we can maybe tone that down a little bit, I'd appreciate it. Let's see. So next question. So all the agencies mentioned, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, et cetera, can be said to be under regulatory capture. Given the severity of sage-grouse population decline and their nearing extinction, we're in a race against sage-grouse extinction. How do we fight regulatory capture? That's a big one.
I'm going to chime in again for the role of litigation. These agencies all have statutory obligations that they can't ignore. So this is where litigation plays an incredibly important role to make sure that they're not violating basic obligations under the Endangered Species Act, under the National Environmental Policy Act, and other bedrock environmental laws that until we have a Congress that wants to change those laws are going to be sort of the bare minimum of what agencies are required to do.
I would just add that there is more that can be done to, you know, reform or advance how some of the agencies are looking at these things. You know, the Bureau of Land Management has a history of being a can-do permitting agency, and they're still under pressure like that to produce. And so I think that does get back to reaching our lawmakers and letting them know that there are other values, that there's other things that we'd like to see coming off of these landscapes besides more or other things like that.
Great, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Sarah. Let's see. So I know this was covered briefly. Steve, I believe you covered this towards the end, but I had quite a few questions about the sage-grouse rider. If somebody could really quickly just go back over the status of that, it would probably help a lot of people.
Sure. Well, the annual spending bill is still being debated, and right now the grouse rider is not in, but there is a chance that as part of the final, you know, grand compromise, it could get added back. In fact, we know that there's a number of Republicans in Congress who are demanding that all the old riders be kept in, and so we've not really heard any details of this. There's, you know, a tremendous amount of pressure building to reach a final agreement, and so we need to let our lawmakers know that we want to see a good bill, one that does not sacrifice our wildlife any longer.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Let's see what else we have here. A pretty big one, but what action can people take to advocate to protect public lands?
Wow, that's a big question. They can get involved in the NEPA process and comment on plans and policies that are proposed in sage-grouse habitats, but they can also contact their representatives in Congress and ask them to have strong protections for the sage-grouse habitats and also to remove the listing rider that prevents ESA protections. I think that's very important. And I remember that back in 2014, or maybe it was 2015, I was in a meeting with some members of what was called the Dream Team of the administration, sage-grouse folks. And I was told that the reason that there was that the 2014 omnibus rider went in was that there wasn't the Congress wasn't hearing from anybody on sage-grouse And that was galling for me to hear because I had just come from a meeting with Brian Schott's staff, and he's the senator from Hawaii. And his staffer said that the sage-grouse was the biggest issue they were hearing about from their constituents in Hawaii. And yet, it wasn't enough to kind of keep that rider out. And so hearing more from the public clearly in that moment was needed.
Okay, thanks, Erik. Well, that's about it for questions that we've had, unless somebody wants to shoot something else out there into the chat.
Hey, Patrick, if there's been a lot of stuff on wild horses, I'd like to address that issue briefly. There's been a lot of mention of the Coates et al. Study, which is kind of a California, Nevada study that found that wild horses, when they're above appropriate management level, are correlated with sage-grouse declines in those areas. I find that study a little suspect because, first of all, in 2013, the National Academy of Sciences put out an analysis of the BLM's appropriate management levels in part and found them not to be based on anything in science. And so kind of making that the yardstick by which you measure sage-grouse population declines is a little squirrely. And the other thing that I find suspect about that study is it uses a Bayesian modeling approach. And the methods look at, of course, Pierre pointed out they didn't look at livestock and the same lands, and that's true, and that's a good observation. But these Bayesian models are very complicated and hard to interpret. And the models, the data was offered to the model and was then given several transformations. And what that says is that the original data didn't meet the model assumptions for either normality or some other data attributes. And that would be expected if you were measuring something against something that's not a biologically valid kind of yardstick. So I would like to see some real analysis on that Bayesian model and to see whether the model's assumptions were met. Because I'm concerned about that. There are several other studies that I'm aware of that are really suspect. For instance, there's Cowek et al. Out of Karen Launchbaugh's shop, which basically admitted in the methods that instead of using a random sample of where to measure the riparian damage for horses and cattle, what they did was they asked the BLM and ranchers where they should put their data points. I mean, rule number one in science is that you have to have random measurement of data. You can't have somebody, particularly somebody who's biased towards removal of wild horses, select where you're going to measure, or they're going to measure the places where, wild horses are having the greatest impact compared to cattle. So, that was a really suspect study. There was another Coates et al. Study that was a small study where they had 9 data points out of 247 where they had any wild horses present at elect sites at all. And their big headline finding was that wild horses disturb sage-grouse breeding. But the fact of the matter is, in that study, the 85% confidence intervals between wild horse affected and unaffected overlapped, which suggests that there wasn't a significant difference. So it seems like we have scientists that are using what's called inductive reasoning. In other words, starting with a conclusion and then trying to cook up a method to get to that conclusion instead of just putting a hypothesis out there, rigorously testing it, and letting the data dictate what the finding is. And there's a lot of really suspect stuff going on in science. And I think that in some respects, the scientific community, and I say this as a scientist who's been published in the peer review literature, the scientific community in some respects seems to be taking its cues from fake news and journalism and trying to create narratives that they can then support with studies that are potentially fraudulent. And we know for a fact this is happening because Rob Roy Ramey in his Preble's meadow jumping mouse studies was investigated for this and found to have fraudulent studies that did get published and did pass peer review. And so this is, I think, an increasing problem in science where we need a little more oversight.
Wow, thanks, Erik. That's a heck of an answer. can see we've got a couple more questions trickled in here. So one is, could the Recovering American Wildlife Act and the 30 by 30 initiative help strengthen the ESA?
Steve, why don't you take that one?
Well, I think Recovering America's Wildlife Act could certainly help, provide for more sage-grouse conservation work. So yeah, that could certainly be a helpful bill. What was the rest of the question?
Person was also asking about the 30 by 30 initiative, if that will help.
Right. Yeah, that's still a little bit amorphous. The administration is currently in a comment period about the mapping project, and so if you have ideas for how they could use this map in development to advance conservation, I mean, I've got some ideas along those lines, and have been working with some people on that. So I think I'm hopeful the administration will establish a process where science can be brought to bear, and we identify the most important lands, from a biodiversity and a climate perspective for conservation. And then, obviously different strategies can then be brought to bear to conserve those lands, whether they be, public or private. I think we've gotten, fairly good at developing different strategies for these different areas. And I think that really the public lands piece is, particularly important for sage-grouse, because when we look at the priority grouse populations, they are clustered predominantly on public lands. So advances there could particularly benefit the grouse.
Great, thank you, Steve.
Let's do a couple more questions, maybe two more.
The recent BLM range-wide study showed dramatic depletions of native forbs that grouse chicks eat. How can we fix that?
Well, certainly, depletions of forbs are a function of, everything that's eating the forbs, I think, first and foremost. And so, you have, of course, the obvious thing in the BLM is permitting is the livestock that are out there. Cattle eat forbs to a certain extent. Domestic sheep eat forbs. If there are wild horses, they're more, they graze on everything. They're very non-selective in their grazing. So that's overlaid on top of those livestock. And then you have the native species of herbivores, everything from mule deer and elk on down to grasshoppers and Mormon crickets, and they can eat forbs as well. I think one of the things that we can do with forbs is recognize that this whole suite of herbivores is having a collective and cumulative effect on your forbs and your grasses. And so the Bureau of Land Management, when they're typically authorizing 50 or 60 or even 65% of the annual forage production to be removed for livestock, then you're leaving behind 50% or even as low as 45% of that annual forage production, not just for all those other native herbivores, including the sage-grouse chicks that need to eat the forbs, but also for the grasses and the forbs to survive themselves. And what we have in this broader context is the BLM fundamentally authorizing overgrazing as its modus operandi and its standard policy and practice. And even if you look at at Holacek's range management textbook, in arid regions, he recommends 25 to 30% of forage removal to be the maximum, not even thinking about sensitive wildlife species habitats, but just as a baseline for normal business operations, you shouldn't be exceeding 25 to 30% if forage removal. I think we need to bring that number down.
Hey, great. Thank you, Erik. And well, I'm going to throw in one of my questions here. It's kind of a wonky one, but I was hoping Sarah might be able to answer this. Regarding the various habitat management areas that the ARMPA's created, you mentioned how there's little to no enforceability on those. Could you speak to that a little bit more? why it's not so enforceable? Why we're so limited?
Yeah, so the habitat management areas themselves are enforceable, and these are basically lines on a map that designate particular areas as the most important habitat because of breeding densities, because the habitat's relatively undisturbed, or various other reasons. And then there are lesser categories of habitat that are the lowest being general habitat, which tends to be sort of a sacrifice zone where we allow a lot more development to occur. But I think what your question is getting at was some of the grazing restrictions in the 2015 plans. There were habitat objectives written into the plans. But on grazing in particular, not a lot of enforceable mechanisms. The plan sort of kicked the can down the road and said, when we revisit, grazing on particular allotments, we'll look at the science, we'll look at the habitat objectives, whether they're being met, and then incorporate terms and conditions into the grazing permit to meet those. The problem is, as a result of other federal laws, that process doesn't actually happen now, or it happens very infrequently for grazing. And so that kicking the can down the road process isn't actually working in practice to change grazing to meet sage-grouse habitat needs.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Good answer. Let's see. Adam, how are we on time? Are we wanting to keep this past 8?
If you have another question that you want to get out there, go for it. Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
Yeah, we've got one more, I believe. I'm going to turn it into a question. It sounds like one. It's regarding lithium mining coming to Nevada. There are many mining permits coming up. Is anyone looking at possible impacts? I'm assuming this was impacts on sage-grouse in particular.
I think there are organizations that are looking at this. I know WWP is litigating Thacker Pass primarily because that mine was sited inside sage-grouse PHMA and is not compatible with sage-grouse habitat, function and population survival. But we're going to see we're going to be seeing a lot of increase in demand for lithium, and there aren't a lot of specialist groups that focus primarily on mining. So I think that there's, the conservation community is going to be challenged by lithium mining.
Okay, well, let's wrap it up there. And a big thank you to everyone for joining us tonight and our panelists. This has been a really great presentation by everybody. So thank you.